Okay, I believe we're now recording. So let's just start off with a little look at outcomes. And feel free to mute your microphone unless you're talking. Outcomes. I want to raise one topic that you all saw Kevin posted on. Under outcomes, not under gender from last week. But it was a very interesting idea that he had, that he would like to think about not just Luke for its own sake, but Luke in relation to Matthew and Mark. And I think that's a really interesting idea, because part of the point of our being together in this course is that you'll get more familiar with Luke and Acts. But of course, we have to have an eye to Matthew and Mark as well, because that's what we looked at before. So I think Kevin's point is a very good one. And we might have an eye to that with regard to projects that people might write on, about which I've posted nothing so far. So don't think that you're behind, because you're not. I haven't done a thing about it. I'm still thinking about how to connect outcomes with measuring outcomes. And this could be, an outcome could be simply to have a sense of Luke in relation to Matthew and Mark, and then to choose a topic that allows you actually to situate that topic in Luke with regard to Matthew and Mark's take on that topic. So for example, you could do a paper on Christology in Luke. What's Luke's ideas about Jesus? In contrast to and consonant with Matthew and Mark's Christologies as well. So that's just an idea. I'm thinking out loud about it, and if anybody wants to say anything, I'm happy to see your posts online or to hear you say something now.
I really like the idea of looking at things in totality, because really get a sense of the whole canon. And actually, I think in one of the articles we read, it really talked about what Luke has, what Mark doesn't have, vice versa, and you really get a truer picture. Realizing that these were several schools of thought that were going around, you get more of a completeness.
Yeah. And I mean, it's quite clear that the church has inherited a fourfold gospel. So that, it's a way of taking account of the church's assessment of not just one. Well, there's one good news, of course, but there are four gospels. And so Kevin's point is a really good one, given the history of tradition as well. So I'll just bear that in mind when we come to do maybe projects. If that's okay. Great. So for example, another project. Last week we were talking about gender, and you could compare and contrast Luke's treatment of gender, both masculine and feminine, and gender performance in regard to gender issues in Matthew and Mark. You'd have a shorter paper, but I mean, you could, everything that we could do, pneumatology, spirit language, is much more developed in Luke than it is in Matthew and Mark. But that doesn't mean that spirit isn't in Matthew and Mark. It just means Luke's take on it is different than Matthew and Mark's, and it would be useful to put them all together and see how they work. So those are some ideas. Great. So I'll bear that in mind when I get to post about projects you might do. And so keep giving input into that. That's very useful. Thank you, Kevin. Okay. So now today we're dealing. We should all be in the same page, and of course. That was because we missed out a week at the beginning. So I'm hoping that you've all had a chance to look at the article on Holy Spirit, which I think was week 2 or something like that. You can't really understand Luke Acts without notions of the Spirit. So if you haven't, it's a very simple page to go through. So just have a look at that. So now we're going to all focus on what some people call the central section of Luke, because that's something that's absolutely distinctive about Luke's gospel. And we have to all be on the same page in regard to that and know what we're talking about. And some people have called it the journey to Jerusalem, but I gave you a whole article on it by somebody with an unpronounceable German name, unless you're German. I know some of you are. So Yeah, you can pronounce it. But but basically, the argument is that in the middle of Luke's gospel, and here I'm hoping you all have Bibles, in Luke chapter 9, so have a look in your Bible. In Luke chapter 9, verse 51, we get a verse that marks out the beginning of the central section. Obviously, the people who created chapter and verse did not think that 951 belonged to a central section. Okay, so you know very well that the history of division of the Bible into chapters and verses happened in the Middle Ages. First of all, in the period of William Tyndale, chapters came into being. And then sometime later, in the time of Stephen Langton, who was an Archbishop of Canterbury in the UK, verses came into being. And so 951 then sits in the middle of chapter 9. If people who had thought about Luke from the point of view of there being a central section had created chapter and verses, they'd have chapter 10 begin at 951. But this is the result of the text and then ideas about the text being at different periods in Christian tradition. So what is different about 951 as you look at it?
It appears as though Jesus is aware of what is to come and makes the decision that it's time to go to Jerusalem.
Absolutely. So from 951 onwards, the focus is going to be Jerusalem. And when you know something about Luke, you know what that means. You know that it means crucifixion. You know that from Matthew and Mark too. But now that you know that Luke is part of a 2-volume work, Luke Acts, you can see that it's not simply crucifixion that 951 orients the reader to. What else? What else is it in Jerusalem that happens in Acts?
The Great Commandment, the Great Mission.
Pentecost. The Great Commission is in Matthew and it's in Galilee. But in Acts chapter 1, the gift of the Spirit is poured out upon people in Jerusalem. And this means that since they're in Jerusalem for various reasons, the Passover, they assemble there in shock after the crucifixion. From there, from Jerusalem, they are sent out. This is completely different than Matthew and Mark, because in Matthew and Mark, Jesus dies in Jerusalem, and they cannot wait to leave. They want to get the hell out of Jerusalem, literally. And they go to Galilee in 5 seconds flat because they don't like Jerusalem. Now, Luke likes Jerusalem. Luke is an urban guy. So Jesus, as a boy, is taken by his parents to the temple in Jerusalem. You see, there's the Jerusalem front and center. Matthew's birth narrative does not have any good things to say about Jerusalem. Herod's in Jerusalem. It's not great. It's not great. Herod is trying to slaughter all the baby boys. This is not good. Jerusalem is a place to be avoided in Matthew. But in Luke, Jesus is brought by his parents to Jerusalem from the beginning. And so even if the crucifixion takes place in Jerusalem, 951 orients you not just to Jerusalem, but to Pentecost, which is from Jerusalem that the disciples will go out. Where? Well, then you have to read Acts. They go everywhere, exactly. Read Acts. Philip goes to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian eunuch and Philip meet on some road south of Jerusalem. So, Ethiopia, there's a whole of Africa, is happening. So Jerusalem and Africa is therefore connected. It's very exciting. Paul's so-called missionary journeys start. He doesn't go to Jerusalem very much, but he goes from Jerusalem out through Asia Minor, over to Greece, for God's sake. He's in Athens. I mean, my goodness. So you go from Jerusalem to Africa, from Jerusalem to the center of the world, to Rome. I mean, where is it you don't go from Jerusalem? It's kind of the pivot of the whole thing. And if there are communities not mentioned, they should be mentioned, because Jerusalem is the focus. So 951 is very interesting in its focus on Jerusalem. And this means that everything from 951 onwards is conceptualized in relation to Jerusalem. And I'm going to take you through a little bit about what that actually means. It means that the Good Samaritan, Luke 10, must be understood in the context of a journey to Jerusalem. It means that Mary and Martha in Luke 10 must be understood in the context of, not just as a story for themselves, although it's a great, these are great stories along the way. They're parables and so on, this illustration. The prodigal son parable must be understood in relation to Jerusalem. The rich man and Lazarus must, do you see? Everything from 951 onwards is going to be shaded by this journey to Jerusalem. Now, what is the language that Luke is using? I'm using the King James, which gives it to me very easily. What language do you have? You've got Jerusalem, but how is it? What? It doesn't say he read the GPS and set out for Jerusalem. So what is the language that it uses?
Turned his face toward Jerusalem.
Yes. Now,
set out messengers ahead of him.
Yeah, here's the thing. The phraseology there is very particular. It's very particular. Turned his face. I'm sorry, but if you are journeying to New York, or if you're journeying to Richmond, Virginia, you simply journey to Richmond, Virginia, or go to New York. But why turn your face? In the King James, set his face. It's archaic. It's archaic language. To set your face is right out of Hebrew scriptures. Think of Hebrew phrases like, lifted up your eyes and look. I mean, in English, we just say, she looked. But in Hebrew, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked. That's because it's a Hebrew phrase. Luke is using, as Luke did in the birth narratives, in the days of old, when women were barren and King Herod was the king of Judea, angels appeared and blah, blah. Do you see what I mean? Luke brings out this style, the old-fashioned style, in 951 by using the phrase, set his face. And English-speaking readers can see how that works. In the King James, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. It means he's a one-eyed wombat, as we say, on that issue. He's not going to deviate. He's not going to go the wrong direction. He will not pass go and collect 200 or whatever it is in the Monopoly. Now that we've got a pivot into the old-fashioned language of 951, you can see back into the beginning of the verse that this old-fashioned language is the only language of the verse in King James. And it came to pass. What do you have in your translation at the beginning of 951?
Now it happened.
And that's it. That is Hebrew phraseology. Now it happened that something, something, something. In Hebrew, once upon a time. It's not that it's out of sync, but rather that now it happened that he went. You don't need to say this, but to say it is to evoke that old-fashioned language of the Hebrew Bible. And it came to pass. And then it goes on. I'm just reading King James. When the time was come that he should be received up. What on earth is that about? Do you see? Everything about this verse needs to be unpacked. What does it look like that he should be received up? Well, that's a reference to something, right? You need a footnote on it. Do you have a footnote that explains it? I'd be happy to hear any explanations.
The assumption of Jesus in a whole bunch of Old Testament and Mark refers to the last days of his suffering life, passion, death, and beginning of his glory, resurrection, ascension.
Yes.
John thinking more theologically, uses the word glorify.
Yes. This is Lucan phraseology, because only Luke, at the end of the narrative of Jesus' suffering and death, has the ascension experience. This verse could only be Lucan. There's no ascension in Matthew. There's no ascension in Mark. In John, you get this notion of being lifted up. But that's not quite the same thing as an ascension, because John doesn't describe an ascension. So this language of being lifted up, being received up, belongs to Luke's language of what happens to Jesus after crucifixion and death. Ascension. I used to live near the Church of the Ascension, and it had a beautiful stone frieze around the outside of the church. And if you went to the far outside of the west door, the far right side, you could see the feet of Jesus as he took off into the cloud. All you could see were the feet hanging down. He was on a vertical trip. That's ascension. That's Luke. And this is what 951 refers to. So just think Luke, think ascension. And the old-fashioned languages. Okay.
There's a similar cartoon. That's probably where they got it.
Yeah. I'm sure there is one. That would be a Lucan cartoon. That would be great. Good. Okay, so just going on here, I'm just reading the King James. And sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. So he's wherever he is in chapter 9, verse 50, he's now reorienting himself to go to Jerusalem. And since he entered into the Samaritan village, he must be somewhere north of Jerusalem, because Samaria is north of Jerusalem. You need a map to remember all these things. But they did not receive him, verse 53, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem, right? So can you see that the whole of this section shows that everything that happens, wherever he goes, whichever village or town through he passes, he has decided to go to Jerusalem. Now, this doesn't mean that in verse 54 he gets there. In fact, one of the interesting issues is, where does this central section of Luke end? So if I just then jump to the end of the central section, have you found that yet? Let's go to Luke 19.
You still doing class?
Now in Luke 19, verse 1, Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now Jericho is really much closer to Jerusalem, as you know, if you've been to the Holy Land or you have some sense of geography. So we know he's getting pretty close, okay? And in chapter 19, he meets a man called Zacchaeus. We've mentioned Zacchaeus a little bit, and we're going to say more about Zacchaeus again, but we're not going to do it right now. And let's see, moving along here, verse 11, after the little interlude about Zacchaeus, Jesus spoke a parable because he was near to Jerusalem. So in 19:11, we're getting closer to Jerusalem. Okay? You see how the gospel is giving you notices about where we are in the journey of Jesus. So Jesus gets to Jerusalem sometime in chapter 19. Because by the end of chapter 19, verse 45, he went into the temple. This is not the temple in Jericho, my friends. There's only one temple. It's the temple. It's in Jerusalem. And it's still standing at this point in Luke's understanding of how the gospel works. He went into the temple and began to cast out those that sold therein and them that bought, saying, my house will be a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves. And verse 47, he taught daily in the temple. He has arrived. So he gets to Jerusalem in chapter 19. It doesn't actually say, he enters into Jerusalem, but it pretty much, he's journeying to Jerusalem in 35. he travels on a donkey, and you know that is Luke's version of the triumphal entry, the entry into Jerusalem. So, and then he weeps over the city. Verse 41, when he comes near, he beheld the city and wept over it. So he's weeping over the city. So really, sometime around 41 and 45, he gets to the temple in chapter 19, and then he's there to die. I mean, that's it. He's not going to leave it again. I mean, he might go to the Mount of Olives, for Gethsemane and so on, but basically he's there. Okay, so we'd have 9:51 to chapter 19. The whole of that section then is oriented as the central section. Now, let's just go back to chapter 9. Now we know where it ends. Let's go back to facets of chapter 9. Okay, we saw that the Samaritan village didn't receive him in 9:53 because he was determined to go to Jerusalem. But we saw that it's going to take from chapter 9 through chapter 19. In other words, it takes nine chapters to get there, 8 or 9 chapters to get there, which means that it's going to be a long journey. It's going to be a long journey, which raises the question about what sort of journey this is. And a very simple answer is that it's a theological journey, not a geographic journey. It's a journey that evokes journeys of the past, of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. Did the Israelites go directly from A to B in the wilderness? No, they wandered. You've seen this from the Hebrew Bible sections that you've done. They wandered around hither and yon everywhere and so on. And this kind of wandering is the sort of thing that happens in the journey to Jerusalem in Luke's gospel. It is not a journey that goes from A to B. It is a journey that has a theological purpose, which is, as the Israelite wanderings were, to create a nation. This is how you form a nation. If you've ever been on a pilgrimage, this is not what Luke's idea is, this is my idea. If you've been on a pilgrimage, you get bonded to the people with whom you travel. If you've been on the road to Santiago de la Compostela, wherever it is you've been on the pilgrimage, maybe in Walsingham or Canterbury or something. Look at Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. I mean, those people who told tales together, they bonded. That's what's the point of Chaucer's book, Canterbury Tales. So what Luke is doing is saying, okay, from now on, Jesus is going to Jerusalem, and the community is shaping itself around him. They've heard lots of things up to chapter 9, but now they'll be journeying. And in the journey of the travel, they will form themselves in relation to him. Why? Because they're stuck with him, 24/7. I mean, he's going to form a community. So all of this section is going to be about community building. And it's going to be about who's outside. Yes. Because once you form yourself as a community, you exclude other people. That's just how it works. Stacey.
Yes, yeah. Because I wrote about this because I feel very strongly about this. I think this whole theological journey, like even with the fire and he evokes Elijah, but he doesn't want to punish people and consume him with fire. No, because he's a lot more open and groovy than the other, Elijah was. So I think all the parables, this rounding around is very much about, I'm going to go all around here so I can get everybody from out there. And every parable is about that. The whole, and even where it's in Matthew, it changes it through the whole thing. So,
Yep. Excellent. So
the best thing I liked about this.
So glad. 56, Stacey is saying, for the Son of Man is not come to destroy people's lives, but to save them. So they go on to another village. No, you may not bring down fire on the wretched Samaritans. This is, we're not here for destruction. We're here to focus on my prophetic death. I mean, that is definitely going to happen. But off we go to another village, verse 56. And then, verse 57, as they go along the way, and I want you to notice at the beginning of 57, the traveling verbs, as they go along the way. You might ignore them, but after this class, you never will again. Because you know that they're all connected. They're all connected to the traveling to Jerusalem. They're not accidental. They're not like, oh, he's going to have a coffee, or he's gone off to have lunch with someone. No. As they went on the way, what way? The way to Jerusalem. There's only one way. They're going to Jerusalem. So watch out for all those traveling things. It came to pass, old-fashioned language, as they went in the way. Okay, now what happens? A certain person says to him, I'm going to follow you. This sounds great, because that's what we want. We want people to follow Jesus, and they're going to be shaped around him and so on. And Jesus says, well, actually, it's not that easy. Verse 58, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, and the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. This is a set of proverbial sayings about the, shall we say, the homelessness, the restlessness of what will now characterize following Jesus. So you're following Jesus, not into a nice, cushy 5-star hotel on the way to Jerusalem, where you get massages and swim in oases. And no. You're actually going to be homeless. You're not going to have anywhere to lay your head. So this is not much fun if you decide to follow me. And there's no reply from the guy who said, I'll follow you. We don't know, okay, well, did it work? Did it not? We don't know. So 59, he said to another, follow me. So Jesus is taking the initiative because maybe the first one was not so easy. But he said, no, I am going to keep a law that says, honor your father and mother, which is, of course, the law right out of the 10 Commandments, which is to treat your parents even in death with respect and fulfill the law. And Jesus said, no, even that commandment is superseded by this travel to Jerusalem. Let the dead bury their dead, but you go and preach the kingdom of God. Now, the verb go is a traveling verb. It's like, and it came to pass that as they went. But go, verse 60, go thou and preach the kingdom of God is what you have to do, you have to start to do along the way. So I don't know if it means that he will be going with Jesus or if it means he will go somewhere else and preach the kingdom of God after he's finished burying the dead. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he didn't follow Jesus. You can see what's going on, right? And the third one then, I will follow you, verse 61, but let me first go and bid someone farewell. Oh yeah, the people who are at home in my house, bid them farewell. And Jesus said, no. You cannot look back. This is an urgent thing. So you can see that the whole of the rest of this chapter is oriented towards don't be distracted. Don't be distracted. Don't think you've got other religious obligations. Everything is now focused on this whole journeying thing. So I'm just being a footnote to Stacy on this, just to point out all the details about the orientation.
Can I say something real quick or ask something real quick?
Keep
I was reading. So when you were talking about the central, okay, where is it? Okay, here it is. Luke 19:10, I thought was basically, even though it's not the end of Luke, but for me, that's what the whole thing is about right there. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. So it's like the whole central thing is concluded right there.
I like that, Stacey. You could make a good argument for that. Yeah, I really like that, because in the next verse, he's right near Jerusalem.
So it's like
absolutely.
This is the whole point of the trip.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
Excuse me.
Hello?
Oh, sorry. I hit the button.
That's okay. Chapter 10. We're not going to do this all the way through. We're just going to do it a little bit into chapter 10. Okay, so if the point of following Jesus is to be shaped around Jesus into a community, then you can see what's going on in chapter 10 immediately. He's appointing 72 others. This goes to show that disciples are much larger than 12 in Luke's gospel, and they're going out 2 by 2. They're going into not just villages, but every city and place. So now they're becoming completely urban. They're not just, people skulking around the countryside. They're now going into urban places. City, polis in Greek, polis. There's kind of, if you're an urban person, like I live in Brooklyn, so, people in New York tend to think of New York. Is there life after New York? I don't know. You know what I mean? It's that kind of idea. The city is the center of the universe, where Jesus himself would come. So he's saying to them, verse 2, The harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Pray therefore that the Lord of the harvest would send forth laborers. And go, verse 3, go your ways. I'm sending you out. So the minute they get to go with him to Jerusalem and stop being distracted, he begins to send them out. But you have to imagine that as they go out, he is traveling along. So they come back to him in a different place, just as they themselves are having a different experience. And what they do is they don't carry anything along the way. Verse 4, no purse, no scrip, nor shoes. Don't be distracted, and say to whichever house you go in, peace be to this house. And if you're welcomed with peace, if the Son of Peace is there, your peace shall rest upon it. And if not, if you're not welcomed with peace, then your peace will turn back to you. Remain in a house, eating and drinking, for the labor is worthy of a hire. Don't go from house to house, and into whatever city you go, and they receive you, eat what they set before you. You will get hospitality. This is the ancient exercise of hospitality. It's not so ancient to people in non-Western countries today. You go to a strange country, somebody offers you hospitality. You offer hospitality to total strangers because you will be a stranger sometime, and so you want then to return the hospitality. And heal the sick. Verse 9. Heal the sick. So they're dispatched, 70, 2 by 2, to do miraculous things, heal the sick, and say to them, and here's Luke's central message of the kingdom of God has come near. Your presence and what you can do, and the hospitality that you receive and that you will give, that is the sign that the kingdom of God is near. You could take it as a geography. You know, it's like Jesus journeying to Jerusalem, the kingdom of God is near. But there will be cities into which you go, verse 10, when they don't receive you. And to those cities you will wipe off the dust that is on your feet. And you will say, we wipe off the dust against you. Nevertheless, the kingdom of God has come near. And then Jesus says some pretty judgmental things about people that reject the 70 or the 72 disciples. It shall be more tolerable in that day for Sodom than for that city. So there'll be judgment against cities that do not receive these disciples. And here they're uttered as woes in verse 13. Chorazin, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works had been done in Tyre and Sidon, which have been done in you, they had a great while ago repented, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But you, Capernaum, you were exalted to heaven, you'll be thrust down to hell. So you can see now that there's a judgment against people who reject or accept the disciples that are sent out by Jesus. So really everything is beginning to pivot on the journey and responses to those on the journey. In verse 17, the 70, having been dispatched and having been told what to do and having been told what to say and to eat and to exercise the ministry of healing the sick, they return in verse 17. So this is, this is sort of accelerated discipleship. And they're really happy. They return with great joy. And they say, even the devils are subject to us through your name. In other words, they've been able to do not just healings, but exorcisms as well, which is really exciting. And this is what Jesus says. I beheld lightning. I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. In other words, because of what you were able to do, I had a vision that the powers of evil had fallen, like the story of Lucifer, who was an angel of light who fell out of heaven, according to Milton, Paradise Lost. Perhaps you know that. This is Jesus in an apocalyptic prophetic moment of vision in verse 18. And then he continues, I give you, verse 19, power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Notwithstanding, don't rejoice that the Spirit, don't get an ego trip out of this. Don't rejoice that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice because your names are written in heaven. So this is not about self-gratification, aggrandizement. This is about what you can do in terms of helping to restore people who are under evil powers. And then Jesus continues, and we could go through each of these verses to see how it works out. But let's go on to chapter 10, verse 29. This begins the great Lucan story. Only Luke. the great Lucan story, prompted by some guy, a lawyer, verse 25, he meets along the way, who wants to justify himself and says, well, who is my neighbor? You know, you're asking, love God, love your neighbor. This is a lawyer. What does it mean? Which one is the neighbor? Especially if you're traveling. I mean, you couldn't say the neighbor is in the next door house, right? Because you're not in a house, you're traveling. So what sort of fluidity now should we attach to the category of neighbor? Jesus knows what's going on and tells the story. Okay. So now, you all know the story of the Good Samaritan. That's what this is. This is the Lucan parable. And the article I gave you pointed out that most of the Lucan parables occur in this section of Luke's gospel. So now, just look at the parable from the point of view of the journey to Jerusalem. And how do you get a different understanding of it?
It could have actually happened to them, since they're traveling also.
Could have happened to them, but let's be even simpler. What's the geography of the parable of the Good Samaritan? Verse 30. A certain man went down from Jerusalem. What's wrong with that? It's wrong. You should not be going away from Jerusalem. You should be going towards Jerusalem. So right there, the problem is set in the geography. Now, you can preach the parable of the Good Samaritan without even noticing that, and it will be a fantastic story about, the surprise that the person who rescues the Good Samaritan... Wait, just one second. Sorry. Minor domestic emergency. You can interpret the parable of the Good Samaritan. You've heard plenty of sermons on the parable that pay no attention to the context of the parable, which is that it occurs within the section in which Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem. But if you put it, as we are now doing, into that context, you can see that the journey away from Jerusalem is not a good thing. So this guy is going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And it's not too surprising then, since he's going away from Jerusalem, that he falls among thieves. So on the one hand then, the parable is about going in the wrong direction. You could say as Bob is doing, that this might happen to all of them. They might be temporarily distracted and go in the wrong direction. And that would be a good way to read this. But you could also do what I was trying to do, namely ask a question about in the journey, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? So let's see.
Okay, on mine it says the priests represented the highest religious leadership.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, and it's not my idea, I read it somewhere, that we're talking about the legality coming down and love replacing it. So when you're talking about elevation, is that what you're getting at?
Not really. Not
okay,
really.
Then scratch
What
that.
were you thinking about? What were you thinking about elevation? Which bit is the elevation?
I was just, because I need GPS for GPS. So I have no directional, but I was just thinking because in my footnotes, it was talking about the priest is the highest legal.
Oh, I see.
You see what I'm saying? And so now you have the Samaritan, and there's this switch of between legalism coming down and what Jesus is teaching going up.
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering, but never mind.
Yeah.
Now, what struck me is that the priest is also leaving Jerusalem, if I'm reading this correctly.
Yes, he's also leaving Jerusalem.
It's like everybody's getting out of Dodge.
You've been to Jerusalem, Kevin.
I mean, the priest is leaving, the Levites leaving.
Right. I cannot but help be reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s exposition of this parable, which starts off by saying that Mrs. King and I went to what is then called the Bloody Pass, which was the geography outside Jerusalem going down to Jericho. And he said, if you ever get the chance, it's probably not the same entirely as it was then. Remember, this was decades ago that Dr. King would have been in Jerusalem. But he said you wouldn't, in your right mind, go into that direction of leaving Jerusalem. It is kind of high, high walls, high cliffs, and easy ambushes, and dark, and so who on earth would want to go? But apparently, they're all getting out of Dodge.
Yeah.
There's a priest.
Well, actually, on our journey, we were blocked by leaving through one of the checkpoints, and that's the journey that we took.
Really?
Wait, really?
Yes,
Could you describe?
It was very mountainous. Basically, there were Bedouins there. It was very desert-like. It was very desolate. It was really a long and windy journey. It really was amazing.
And you did it in a certain time of day. Was it in the morning or?
It was in the late afternoon to early evening.
Late afternoon, yeah.
Right. So we had to make our way back to Jerusalem from Jericho, and the checkpoint that we would have gone through, there was some trouble there, maybe a couple of days earlier, and they shut off that checkpoint. So we had to go this other way, which took us an additional 45 minutes to an hour to get through that passage, and it was just it was really unlike anything that we had seen before.
Wow. Excellent. Very helpful. So glad you went. Sorry about the delay. Okay. So I know that you've heard sermons on the Good Samaritan and how unusual it is that the Samaritan is good. I get that. But in the context of this journey to Jerusalem, what is the neighbor? What is the neighbor that Jesus is trying to explain? That's the point now, to put it, the Samaritan parable, into that context. I think Jesus is saying something like, once you are on a journey, your whole world is destabilized. Let's see. You're walking along a road and you don't know who you'll meet on the road. You're in a train, you don't know who you meet on the train. You're on a bus, you don't know who you'll meet on a plane, you don't know who you see what I'm getting at? So once you're traveling, you're out of your comfort zone. And when you're out of your comfort zone, it's going to be an extraordinary thing that you will have to take account of, namely, people will rescue you. You will see people rescue other people that you had no idea would do that. You get these wonderful stories about people stuck in airports and extraordinary things that happen in airports. Not very nice things happen in airports, but every now and again, amazing things happen in airports, and people make communities. And so I think it's got something to do with saying your expectations about neighborliness will be completely upturned, and that's the upturning, Stacy. I would attach to that. Dr. King Jr. talks about dangerous altruism. You will see somebody on the other side of the road that is is in great need, and somehow you can see the story that a person is seeing someone bashed over the head and in desperate physical condition, and then somehow they don't think about themselves anymore. They don't think about the danger of the situation, that something awful might happen. They simply cross to the other side of the road and they rescue the guy. And not just that, they rescue the guy, they take him to the inn, and they pay, for a recovery period and so on. So this is what Dr. King means by dangerous altruism. And I think you could say it's empathy. You could say so. The exercise of empathy and altruism towards people whom you think are utterly alien to you is what the Good Samaritan is about. At least it seems to me in this context. And then at the end, verse 36, Jesus tries to draw the conclusion to the lawyer. Which one of these do you think was neighbor unto the guy who fell among thieves? And the lawyer says, whoever showed mercy to him. And Jesus says, go, and you do the same thing. So maybe the lawyer joined him, or maybe the lawyer didn't. I'm not entirely sure. Same thing with the story of Mary and Martha that follows. Now, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
That love a person's actions, not their tribe, not their demographic, not their,
Absolutely.
Get out of that, like you were talking about, out of your safety zone. So we all have this tribal mentality, especially then, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the person you least expect, it always happens.
Exactly.
All of a sudden they emerge, and
Yeah. Okay, so I just need to attend to something else that's happening in the background. Can you look at the story of Martha and Mary from the point of view of the travel section and make some remarks about that in your head, and then I'll come back and I'll be 2 seconds.
Okay. Oh, Kevin, I love that picture you posted of the well, because of last Sunday's reading that you posted on Facebook of the well.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
Was so cool. It was so tiny. I don't know why. I was thinking well, like.
Well, it's like in a lot of these places, they found the well, they built a church on top of it, and then they built another church on top of it. So we were in the basement of a Greek Orthodox church, which is this really beautiful, elaborate space at the top of it, and at the bottom of it, there's this well, and the well is really very, very deep. We all got an opportunity to drink water from the well. It was really an amazing experience. Because I kind of expected it to be like this open space. And, as well.
How wide would you say the well was? Because in the picture it looks really, really narrow.
It is very, very narrow. Actually, maybe the width of it, a small child could get through the hole, I think. But basically, it really wasn't a huge opening at all.
Wow.
And the water is it was a very deep well. Additionally, our guide dropped a stone into it, and it took a good 30 seconds to really hear any sound coming back from it. So really a very deep well, nice cold water. It was amazing.
And that's supposed to be where Jesus was.
Exactly, the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well.
Yeah.
So, Mary and Martha, what are they doing on the journey to Jerusalem?
Martha was distracted, which we were told, like you pointed out in the beginning, not to be.
It's not a good idea. Martha's distracted.
She was welcoming. She welcomed Jesus. She
Absolutely.
offered hospitality.
She did. Now, there's nothing wrong with hospitality, because we've just been told in chapter 10 that it's a really cool thing to receive hospitality. And in some cases you won't get it, in which case shake the dust off. But getting hospitality along the way is a great thing. So what's up with Martha? She's showing hospitality. Okay.
Martha was, I think she was overwhelmingly concerned with providing, whereas Mary was able to offer companionship as well.
Exactly. I think I'm going to follow Stacy here too. Martha was distracted. She wanted to prepare a gourmet meal. Martha was distracted. I've got in King James, verse 40, Martha was cumbered about much serving. She was preparing a gourmet meal. Okay. So there's nothing wrong with hospitality, and it's really cool to see a woman offering hospitality and, doing the whole thing and so on. But what Jesus says to her in 41, in whatever translation you have, is you're anxious and troubled about many things, 42, but one thing is necessary, right? And Mary has chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now, we don't know what one thing Jesus had in mind was. We do know that he's interested in simplicity. He's interested in one thing, not a 5-course meal. And
my translation has it a little different. Yeah. It says, you worry and fret about so many things, and yet few are needed. Indeed, only one. It sounds like the way he sent out the 72.
Yeah. I always think of this when I'm in a situation where I'm just to listen, because obviously I like talking, and so, but it's not about. And so I always think because Mary listens to Jesus, so presence, listening, and not getting distracted by, oh, Stacy, after this you got to go do this, or trying to come up with the answer to the person who's talking. No, it's not. It's just the presence of, I'm like, oh, Stacy, don't be a Martha. Which is not very fair to her, but yeah.
And I recognize, Bob, that we don't know what Jesus understands by one thing. I took it as one dish. That was in itself an interpretation. Do you see? But Jesus is saying something like, don't be over complex. Don't be, as Stacy is saying, be present to the whole thing. Like Mary. Now, Christian tradition for 2,000 years has rescued Martha. Because Christian tradition has said there's a place for active life and there's a place for contemplative life. And one is one and the other is the other. Active and contemplative can go together. So I remember very well all kinds of sermons pointing out that really Martha's choice was perfectly justified. I don't think that's a helpful interpretation. I recognize that it's part of 2,000 years of Christian tradition, but I think that what Mary is doing is what Jesus is commending. It doesn't mean you can't eat. Of course, you have to eat along the way, but you can get hospitality along the way. It doesn't distract you from the focus of the whole journey, which a long meal might do, perhaps. So I recognize there's some ambiguity about what one thing in verse 42 really is, and you've probably got footnotes on it. But I would say that the story of Mary and Martha is a story about not being distracted along the journey. And it does point out, of course, that women are part of the disciples that are sent out 2 by 2 in chapter 10. And in chapter 8, 1-3, we know that women followed Jesus and they paid for expenses out of their resources. And they're listed, their names are listed. Mary, from whom 7 demons were cast out. Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, Chuza, Susanna, and so on, and other people too. So women are part of the traveling band around Jesus, and here we see 2 of them. Chapter 11.
This is the same Mary and Martha, sisters of Lazarus?
Well, they will be identified in John's Gospel as sisters of Lazarus in John 11. I mean, we're about to read that in the lectionary cycle. Yes, absolutely. And it looks very much like they're the same figure. Yeah.
Lived in Bethany. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I could say much more on that, but I'm not going to say much more on that because this is an introductory course. It is not a dissertation course. So, all right. Luke 11. Luke 11 now gives you the Lord's Prayer. Okay, now put it in the context of the journey. Put it in the context of the journey. Can you make some suggestions about how the context of the journey helps us see aspects of Luke's Lord's Prayer that we might not have thought of before?
I'm thinking about the kingdom, and I'm thinking about it in reference to when he sent the 72 out, and they came back, and the hospitality was an example of or a sign that the kingdom is near.
Absolutely, absolutely. Look at verse 3. Give us day by day our daily bread. This is not what Matthew's bread petition says. Give us day by day our daily bread. In other words, this is part of the paradigm now requesting hospitality from God for the journey. For the journey. If I were...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Is it supposed to reference the manna?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Because you could only collect the manna on the day that the manna appeared. And if you are praying for bread each day, day by day, our daily bread, then you pray the prayer at least daily. In the Didache, first century text, the Lord's Prayer is prayed 3 times daily. So you maybe didn't pray it just once, maybe you prayed it more than once. You prayed it for the morning food, you prayed it for the evening food. But there's something else that's even more blatant, and it is that Luke's Lord's Prayer is shorter than Matthew's, which makes sense in a traveling context. You don't want to stop off for great liturgical distractions. Now let's have the great litany, because that'll be a major issue on the journey to Jerusalem if you are distracted by, liturgical detours of one sort. So you get a faster, quicker, more direct, more succinct Lord's Prayer. Father, not our Father who art in heaven. Father, direct address, as Jesus would pray. My whole interpretation is undone by the King James, which insists on giving me at this point the text of Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer. So if you've got the King James, do not be distracted by the King James of the Lord's Prayer in Luke, because it is the Lucan version is much shorter. So that would be one thing I would say. And then, of course, Kevin has made the good point about the kingdom language, thy kingdom come. And we know that the kingdom is near, as Luke 10 verse 11 has already said. Okay, so this is my basic point about this central section, that everything that now happens in the central section can be interpreted in relation to the journey to Jerusalem. At the same time, it can be interpreted discreetly by itself, as you know, in the case of endless sermons on Mary and Martha, sermons on the Good Samaritan, sermons on the parable of Lazarus and the poor man, Lazarus and the rich man, sorry. So all we would do if you were preaching on this section is to have an eye to the wider context, as well as the specific unit of material that is chosen for the gospel for each week. Okay, so that was my point for today. So I'd like to stop there unless there are other observations and questions. But as I said, you'll get the video from today so that you can review it, and I will try to work on project suggestions that are subject to discussion by you and approval by next week. And I hope that all your Lents are going very well in your various parishes and so on. So. And you've had enough of the Great Litany. Okay, great. Good to see you all.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.